it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Alicia Wright, who will be giving a talk called The Making of a Literary Magazine. Originally from Rome, Georgia, Alicia Wright has received fellowships from the Iowa Writers Workshop and from the University of Denver, where she's completing her PhD in English and Literary Arts. She has served as the associate editor of Denver Quarterly and is the founding editor of Annulet, a literary magazine for poetry, literary criticism, and more, and Annulet Editions, a new small independent press. She has taught as a visiting assistant professor of English at the University of Iowa and lives in Iowa City. Her poetry, essays, and reviews appear or are forthcoming in the Paris Review, Kenyon Review, Jubilat, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. A scholar of the poet C.D. Wright, she's editing a cluster of essays, C.D. Wright in Context, for Post 45. Her debut poetry collection, You're Called by the Same Sound, is forthcoming in 2025 from Third Hand Books. As you're about to hear, Alicia is a community builder, both locally, such as through the reading series she curates and hosts here in Iowa City, that bridges town and gown students and faculty and community members with the incredible name Normie Creep in the Sacred Grove, as well as nationally through her work as an editor of the Denver Quarterly, Annulet, and now Annulet Editions. She is a model for how to build the literary community you'd like to participate in by starting your own magazine, press, reading series, and beyond. And we're grateful that she's here today, inspiring you all to do the same. Please welcome Alicia Wright.
So my lecture is called The Making of a Literary Magazine, and it's a little rock and roll, it sounds a little dry, but bear with me. And so I'll just start. And this is the description, but I'm just gonna read it out loud to get it in the room. So we all know, read, and send our writing to literary magazines and journals. And for many of us, publication in their pages is the first time we see our work in print, our first professional nod. But where did this practice come from? Has the mission of a literary journal changed or stayed the same over time? Furthermore, who are these editors that writers are trying to impress? What makes one journal more renowned or popular than another? In this lecture, we'll consider the literary journal as a social form, as a dialogue between writer and editor, editor-writer, writer and reader, that becomes a collage of voices. Through sharing the story of how Annulet came to be, I will endeavor to provide answers and context for these questions, and will, but in turn, hopefully help address what I think helps literary journals and their communities last. And so I imagined when I proposed this lecture that I might be able to actually provide specific answers to all of the big questions that I posed in this description. And in a way, I very well might come close, though it will involve a little deep historical diving and some bold assertions on my part, which I feel both impulsively inclined to make, and even more than that, still surprised to find myself in a position to make at all. You'll hear in this lecture a combination of my own experience interwoven with hints of periodical studies, new media theory, literary history, and my own interpretations and application of these ideas, all in the service of attempting to observe the context, strengths, and practical realities that shape my dearest project in the present that was nearly 2 decades in the making, Annulet. Yes, I did start thinking about this when I was 15 years old. Something that I like to say, to remind myself as much as anything else, is that we live in an extraordinary time for writing, to be a writer. Never before have there been so many fellow writerly comrades, organizations, conferences, festivals, undergraduate and graduate programs, presses, journals, reading series, online communities, international readerships, or other emerging outlets to contribute to and foster literary production, the whole production. This immense proliferation would set many historical hearts pounding with both excitement and disbelief, I think. Insecure as the pre-20th century's aspirational intellectual class of Americans were about whether the settler colonial state that they were building even had a literature distinct from its European antecedents. They really wanted one. Ben Franklin made one, a magazine. It would be more difficult still to imagine our current landscape span of interconnected and independent scenes and distinctively local communities with their own variations of literary life, not to mention the crucial histories of those communities and groups, some known to history and others not, that have preceded us. As an editor, I'm truly excited by the sheer number of brilliant writers whose work I have yet to read and whose submissions I come across in Annulet's inbox queue. Such potential gives me that rare feeling called hope. As a poet, though, this reality of volume, a drop in a vast bucket, makes me wilt a little, to be honest. But that's typically what happens when I think of things in terms of cold, hard numbers. For example, money is communicated by number. You might sense a pattern, a good number, in my thinking. The world I envision, the literary and social values that interest me and that I aim to practice don't include things like competition, scarcity, prestige in the form of social capital, and in that most perfect, unattainable world, money at all. But more on that later, especially when we get to talking about the form of the magazine. The latest and most youthful literary magazine database, ChillSubs, lists 3,265 currently published literary magazines, of which Annulet is one, and organizes them by values such as response time, payment, social media following, and most tellingly, vibe tags, such as, quote, send us your best but less intimidating. That's Annulet's. ChillSubs will, quote, make your writing life not so freaking exhausting, and offers benefits like get published, promote your work, connect with other creatives, and grow as a writer. It promises all without having a mentee B, as the current parlance goes, or a mental breakdown. I love mentee B. These values interest me in that they speak to an apparent tyranny in the face of inscrutable editorial practices, a microcultural economy nearly impossible to enter, and how not just periodicals, but the practice itself of submitting work now creates literary community. The other major submissions tracking database, Duotrope, lists nearly double that number of publishers, but also includes agents. That's thousands of individual exigencies or instances when someone perceived a gap or felt the impulse to become an editor or publisher in order to make a claim upon or within literary culture. It's a lot. So, what is this received form, the literary or little magazine? One way to start would be with the word itself. Magazine comes from the 15th century Arabic word, mahsanun, which means storehouse. The later word used to describe literary periodicals, journal, technically a part of Annulet's full name, Annulet, a Journal of Poetics, Annulet for short, indicates a slightly different published material and audience. And if we're being technical here, journal indicates more expert material for a more specialized audience compared to a general reading public. The literary magazine assembles original writing in the genres of fiction, poetry, and personal essays most typically. A literary journal includes discursive forms such as reviews, interviews, and literary or cultural criticism. No one cares if you mix them up, though, really, unless you're a historian or archivist. I do it all the time. You'll hear it in this lecture. But besides content distinctions, what these terms have in common is in the periodical of it all. They're temporally determined publication, biannual, quarterly, rather than the isolated event of the book, places magazines and journals distinctly in time and in relation to their contexts. These situations are as much aesthetic as they are social, each issue a record as much as a gesture. In an essay on the literary magazine for CLMP, the Council of Literary Magazines and Presses, the editor of New England Review, Carolyn Keebler, describes the form. As galleries of current work, literary magazines offer direct access to the trends and tastes of the times where new ideas and new writers, many of whom exist far from the mainstream, are given their first audience. Because they encompass the living history of literature right into the present day, these journals are useful and vibrant tools in the classroom. In particular, for creative writing students, but more broadly for students of literature and American culture. Or, oh, this. Yes, okay. Or as Zach Peckham more recently suggests with the launch of his new journal in characteristically sardonic fashion, it's something more like a coma, a subset of the larger new publishing project called Community Mausoleum. It's a little grim, but we love it. Literary magazines might also be politically radical or social movement publications, stapled zines passed out at punk shows, or publications from communities currently and historically excluded from the official avenues of literary support and reception, like Vetch, 2015 through 2017, a magazine that was the first of its kind, edited by Kay Gabriel, Stephen Ira, Riley Lyman, and Liam O'Brien, that worked as much to locate editorial stewardship of trans writing with trans writers as it did to work against, quote, the prominence of poetry that hits the palliative buttons of liberal inclusivity-oriented ideology. I can talk us through that one later if you have questions. Or Umbra, the landmark 1960s literary magazine, published by a collective of Black writers and artists on Manhattan's Lower East Side. Their mission statement from the first issue is on the slide. One way to understand what a literary magazine isn't just by the kind of work it puts forward, but would also be by the parameters of its intervention, whether socio-political or into information's flow. But we're moving backwards in time here, so let's commit. Come with me, let's keep going, all the way back, right? Let's try to picture the chronology of the magazine, this trans-historical form, and its whole history in one very large and loose swoop. In Little Magazine World Form, Eric Bolson clarifies the usefulness of considering the literary magazine, especially once it's reached its modernist molting as a form. Form describes the structure of the medium and the nature of the materiality, and it is something that can be concrete and abstract, a category that opens up the magazine to different modes of social, political, historical, economic, and cultural analysis. For me, that's to say, that form, how it's printed, and content, what's on the page, are derived from the circumstantial method by and through which the magazine comes to be. We make it. I'll mention some earliest periodicals, not to be a further crispy bore, but because I believe we can trace many of the values that are expressed by contemporary literary magazines to the use and reception of these early modern examples. It really seems like the mission of literary journals has stayed pretty much the same over time, to me. The practice of publishing magazines has its origins in 17th century France and Germany. Among the earliest examples include Nouvelles de la République des Lettres from 1684, or News from Iowa City, the Republic of Letters. That's not really what it translates to. And it's the first known book review journal. And Erbauliche Munets und Tererungen, roughly translated as Substack, also kidding, that is edifying monthly conversations from 1663 to 1668, edited incidentally, or perhaps not, by a theologian and poet. This was the beginning of what's called learned periodicals. I promise this is all gonna come together, everybody, in which particular knowledge was disseminated to a committed audience or a reading community. In plainer terms, the printed word was distributed as material conversation, as opposed to the privacy of letters or the public cry of political pamphlets. If we looked at The Spectator, the British periodical typically credited as the first modern magazine printed in English, we might take note of how its Enlightenment patriarchal values meant that presumed audiences for its articles fell along gender and partisan lines, and typically emphasized conservative values like edification, family, and moral improvement. Surely no literary magazines do that anymore. Like the novel, a magazine, as we know it today, is an early modern discursive form whose circulation, get ready, buckle up everybody, was made super fluid by the next century's technological developments in production and distribution. It stands to reason that the practice of submitting original writing to magazines was contingent on this expanded physical distribution itself. Correspondence between authors and editors could only begin by contact with a periodical's pages with the names and addresses of the relevant parties. Particularly in the US, 19th century publishers were coerced to cheaper materials, this is the theme, cheap, and broadened infrastructures for audience and delivery meant that by the end of the muckraking era, all the way forward, magazines contained more material geared toward amusement for the broadest of reading publics, shall we say, rather than demonstrations of artistic or cultural innovation. This stressed out the aforementioned aspirational intellectuals, most especially the poets, and even more so the Ivy League educated poets, who would respond by founding magazines such as Hound and Horn, a Harvard literary miscellany, and reincarnating The Dial, the transcendentalist outlet that Emerson once called a journal in a new spirit, which took its name from the figure of a sundial, but was now purchased by a New England textile heir, and would become one of the signature modernist literary journals. It's also been recently again reincarnated in 2023 as a global literary journalism outlet. Forgive me, but I just want to include this utterly sweet excerpt from, that's just out, yep. Excerpt from Emerson's editor's note that from the first issue that appeared in 1840. And so with diligent hands and good intent, we set down our dial on the earth. We wish it may resemble that instrument in its celebrated happiness, that of measuring no hours but of sunshine. Let it be one cheerful, rational voice amidst the din of mourners and polemics. Or to abide by our chosen image, let it be such a dial, not as the dead face of a clock, hardly even such as the gnomon in a garden, but rather such a dial as is the garden itself, in whose leaves and flowers the suddenly awakened sleeper is instantly apprised of not what part of dead time, but what state of life and growth is now arrived and arriving. Bless his heart. But watch out, world. Harriet Monroe and Ezra Pound are about to be ascendant, okay? In addition to writers' own sense of much-needed and incipient aesthetic change, we're just getting the whole, a whole graduate course in like 1 hour, so. The literary magazine's modernist makeover was also housed and funded by art galleries, and was recruited by avant-garde writers and artists as experimental testing grounds for their new work in dialogue with the new European art forms. It's from within this period that the most current incarnation of the literary journal as we know it began to take shape, one that exclusively focuses on publishing writing, one poem expressively oriented on a page, not crammed in a corner amidst reportage or opinion columns. One excerpt from an experimental novel like Ulysses at a time. Ezra Pound, it must be admitted, rather fustily wrote the seminal essay in the field, which gives us the much tinkered with term little magazines, though actually called small magazines, in 1931. You might recognize Harriet Monroe as the founder of poetry. Even though scholars often date the onset of modernist poetry in the US to the launch of Poetry magazine in 1912, I'd also like to point out that she modeled another familiar editorial strategy. Essentially, she crowdfunded it. going in 1910 from Chicago office to parlor of what we'd now serenely call the donor class, pitching her editorial vision for a new periodical that most of the newly minted Chicago well-to-do were more than happy to fund, like an opera house. I just did my version of this by sending out Annulet's first ever newsletter, in which I asked for donations to fund the next 2 years of Annulet editions, which is another move that I've borrowed from literary magazines' trajectories from periodical to book publisher, like Tin House, except Annulet, the journal, isn't going anywhere, or like Fence. Nick Sturm, in his introduction to his indispensable Contemporaries at Post 45 cluster, Little Magazines, gets right to the point of just how much conceptual and historical real estate modernism takes up in the world of literary magazines, which are often harnessed as the examples par excellence of the mode, the workhorses for literary modernism's cart descending a bookshelf. That's my dorky joke, okay. When we put aside work on modernist periodicals, he says, it starts to look like there is a little magazine-shaped hole in periodical studies. For our purposes, this means that few, apart from some editors themselves and a handful of scholars, are putting into writing what's up with little literary journals from the internet era on. Mostly, we talk about the conditions and the consequences of digital literary culture, not as much the journals that comprise it. But as Simone Murray from another cluster, Contemporaries cluster called Ecologies of Literary Publishing, may explain, literary culture is, by the third decade of the 21st century, digital culture. I guess it's true. We're reading all the time. Online literary journals, which even in my memory, didn't have quite the same purchase as print until very recently, and perhaps still don't, host and harbor the vast majority of innovation in literary journal publication, from ethos like Apogee and Honey Literary to implementation. Annulet's online predecessors include, but aren't limited to, Flag and Void, Prelude, The Volta, Typo, Apartment Poetry, and Tagwerk. Its print antecedents in spirit include Lana Turner, Chicago Review, Exquisite Corpse, Denver Quarterly. I read all of these magazines voraciously. It's through reading and studying journals like these that I've realized that literary magazines are not laboratories for the mad scientist editors totalizing self-expression, at least not the ones I like to read, but instead something more collective, networked, and organic. They are the literary world organizing itself, a social collage whose form isn't determined by audience demographics so much as the relative aesthetic merit of the individual works, whether in the same or different genres, published together, ensemble. They will always be formally indebted to the modernist collage. Anyone can be in it. And in this light, it makes it even easier to see that a coterie or community's agency ought or cannot have any expectation resembling an ROI, or would even consider the term loss leader. I'm just being cranky. It's fine. I do have one last modernist era secret to share with you, and it's about Annulet's real dad, but I will get to that in a second. Contemporary print journal culture, as distinct from digital magazine culture, fuses two channels of material legacy from the early print publication that I've described for us today. The first is the question of how the medium might reach its audience from one hand to another. Big name magazines have an interest in nearly infrastructural commercial circulation at grand scale. One source suggests a New Yorker has over 1 million subscribers, print subscribers, for instance. And little magazines foster intimate circulation through hand mailings, postcards, things like Matthias Valina's Dream Delivery Service, in which a poem or dream/dream is slipped under your door before dawn each morning for a month. I would consider this an experiential literary magazine. Chapbooks shared or sold at readings like the Belladonna series, pamphlets, broadsides, and further back, ballads and almanacs, which codified and assisted in the production of daily knowledge and narratives in both oral and codex form. We hear and we hold. Two projects come to my mind as contemporary examples of the same impulse: the Poetry Project newsletter, which both in print and online, which functions essentially like a literary journal, although in its early days circulated more kinds of social information, wryly mimicking society reportage or meeting minutes, and the Spiral Editions newsletter, which is itself kin to 1080 Press's free monthly mail-only newsletter. All these things you can look up and sign up for. These two, in turn, could locate their lineage to the all-important mimeograph revolution, the next stage after modernism in the shaping of the current form of the literary magazine. They don't call it the mimeograph revolution for nothing. The photocopier's mother meant that, especially for countercultures and microcultures, let's talk in the Q&A if you've ever used a mimeograph. That'd be cool to hear about. Especially if you found yourself in Lower Manhattan in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, you can make many copies of your missives and magazines on the very most cheap. Both provisional and deliberately cultivated, this print culture produced whole poetry movements, like the New York School or language poetry, and consequent generations of poetics and poets that we don't even really have clear names for today, yet. Publishing was part of the social fabric. It was how friends made their work news, and news became poetics discourse with an audience. Jerome Rothenberg, in an introduction to language poetry's entry from the book version of this website that you see on the slide, A Secret Location on the Lower East Side, cites the language poet and theorist Ron Silliman, who in an issue of Ironwood, whose final issue I found on the bottom shelf of an Iowa City thrift store, makes important the important point that the phenomenon, language poetry, is based on a created audience. And in this case, language writing, that's my emphasis, is most significantly identified as community-based, with almost all its practitioners sharing, quote, the responsibility of creating the institutions through which the work can be made public. He goes on to say that, quote, the project of this writing is the discovery of a community. Even Lydia Davis and Paul Auster, in their married youth, edited a short-lived Mimeo magazine called Living Hand. That's one for my fiction friends. I haven't forgotten you. I know you're out there. The best way to come to understand this dynamic literary movement is through how prolific community publication creates the conditions for its own easy historicizing, mythologizing, or hype underpinned by critical theory, and whose immediacy would next be replicated by the digital's screens and clicks, and whose materials, like music lovers and vinyl, would be lovingly resuscitated contra the surge of publishing's conglomerate era. Smaller commercial or nonprofit publishing organizations would also follow in mainstream aesthetic suit, trending away from the era's difficult writing, and literary journals that were conceived or harbored by universities would also find tenuous stability in print, like the two that I would one day work for in the 21st century, New England Review and Denver Quarterly. If you've read either of those journals, you might know that they are affiliated with very different wings of US literature. That spectrum, from the mainstream to the experimental, also defines both the idiosyncratic, far from definitive historical maneuvering I've tried to offer you in this lecture, and is likewise the balancing beam of between that I tread upon in my editorial evaluation for Annulet. And though I'm not totally certain, I would guess that regularized open submissions rather than purely solicited coterie submissions became the commonplace from the mid-century on because of institutional requirements, especially if those institutions were publicly funded. I think all of these factors, yes, we've made it. The entire history of the medium in one short hour, incarnate in every issue or iteration of a journal that we read, fold together whenever anyone makes a new literary magazine, whether intentionally or subconsciously. Let's see, where I am. I knew some of these things, but nowhere near as much as I do now, 7 going on 8 issues into my own mostly solo editing venture. But they're all there in the thing that I make, somehow. It's in the nature of the received form. The literary journal is an ephemeral, elastic, portable form, literally designed to circulate, or in digital media terms, to cultivate users, whose formulaic repeatability is sometimes maligned, though what I think is at the heart of such a complaint of too many magazines is their contribution to our information fatigue. Even reading a whole issue of a single journal can feel like a small feat now, right? Editors are people, full stop. Editors are people too, whose role it is to make selections for us, to, at the very least, according to my own foundational ethic, not waste anyone's time. Literary journals are also people who either self-deputize, like me, or who are hired from within the media class to steward a journal with a sizable cultural and financial situation, like the Paris Reviews, or are graduate students cutting their teeth in the trade, typically. A masthead might be more of a protracted editorial or intellectual situationship, you could say, or it might be one to which you can either apply as an intern or a reader and join at your own peril. I'm kidding. Often, these are the first positions of cultural authority a person has occupied. An editor is also the kind of weirdo who willingly enters into reading dialogue with each submission, and subsequently each writer they do or don't publish. So far, we've thought about sociality in terms of an audience of readers who, at least in modern terms, are also probably writers. But editors have an apparent heightened role in the rudimentary yet mysterious arithmetic of making literary capital. What makes one journal more renowned or popular than another? This is more of an intangible, deliberately fiendish question I have posed. Apart from its author's current or subsequent popularity, prizes won, attention, the metrics of prestige that haunt our view of success, I believe there are two factors that help establish a literary magazine for the long haul. The first is the lastingness of its intervention, which takes up questions of literary history and politics as described above. From the Kenyon Review and New Criticism to Fence, which poses reaction that's since mellowed to a cool cynicism as its critical stance, is often the relationship of the journal to the dreaded word discourse, like Bernadette Mayer and Louis Aconchi's 0 to 9 and the Origins of Conceptual Art, or the desire of the editor to supply the correct conditions to attend to their work that fuels longevity. Rebecca Wolf, Fence's founding editor, reflected on that in her origin story of the journal. I was frustrated. Publication in a literary journal seemed to a newly graduated MFA poet in 1993 the pinnacle of achievement. I could not even imagine a book of my poems at that time, though the contest promised to make me rich someday, if only I would pour enough checks into them. And so I devoted 2 years immediately post-grad to the business of getting published, blanketing the poet's marketplace with simultaneous submissions, keeping scrupulous track of my rejections on an alphabetized index cards. It may seem odd to begin the story of a literary journal by talking about my own poetry, but that is in fact where it began. In beginning Fence, I merely extrapolated from the need I felt for a journal that would be unafraid of weirdness and which would respond enthusiastically to freedoms and constrictions of tone, music, and syntax, to a universal need. An intervention seems dramatic, but it's really a delicate thing. Editors often lose their way when they begin to use their journals to prosecute their narrowing taste over time, or as a means to broker their cultural dominance. Further, can the journal's intervention, when it inevitably loses a little escape velocity, become something more like a method, maybe, that transforms, that creates community regard beyond hanging out in the neighborhood treehouse? It appears to be the case that the magazine is a protean expression of established or static communities and their conversations, or is the magazine static and the community and its conversations protean? The secret third thing, well, actually, it's the second factor of lastingness, haunting this history, and that also currently haunts me, is the question of money. Funding, subsidizing, granting, good old-fashioned patronage, sugar daddies, just kidding. Support through, you're supposed to laugh. Support through hand selling or subscriptions that keep a journal going. Really, it depends on whether you have it and want it, or don't have it and don't want it. Journals that start to see a falling sky tend to be ones whose overhead, or capitulation to the necessity of money, begins to close in. It turns out that magazines and journals are the only creative literary form you can just buy. Unlike a sonnet, you can't buy the sonnet. An online journal with no paywall, nor will ever have one, like Annulet, is a literary gesture that has fugitive, though formative, value. At least that's what I tell myself. I am both comforted and alarmed by the fact that it's never a clement time to spend money on something that loses money. Take, for example, the current temperature of how literary things stand right now from Taco Bell Quarterly's Substack post on a similar subject, How to Run a Successful Literary Journal. The literary world is closing up and keeling over around us. Our platforms threaten to crumble, and the algorithms conspire to keep us apart. That I agree with. We might not make it out alive. We don't have time to agonize over the craft of literature. What other talents and skills does everyone bring to the table? Does anyone know anything about raising money? Is anyone good at screaming on social media? Who knows how to design merch? Speaking of merch, I have a few Annulet tote bags for sale after the lecture. Anyway, I remember being called into the president and publisher's office of Grove Atlantic, where I had my first internship after college in 2012, and having an extended discussion as the resident young one about the possibility and perils of making use of the internet for the valiant purpose of staving off imminent media and economic doom in the days of, quote, the death of the book. Foolishly, I suggested the intellectual, and unsurprisingly, right, intellectual route of hyperlinks within ebooks that source images or relevant citations, like if a Sebald novel went online. What I wanted was immersion into the textual world of the book. Little did I know that this was literary criticism. What would emerge from Grove Atlantic's line of inquiry, nothing to do with me, would be a little outlet you might know now as Literary Hub. Just as we think that we might lose a literary form, it's already finding a way to reconstitute itself. I told you several epistemes ago that I'd share with you who Annulet's real dad is. His name is The Explicator, which is a scholarly journal founded in 1941 that exclusively publishes densely researched close readings of poems or prose passages with a hard cap of 1,500 words. I fell in love with the journal after having my mind altered by my fellow University of Denver PhD program attendee, Aditi Machado's close reading, after reading this close reading published in it called The Radial Symmetry of Pain in Robert Creeley's The Flower. Yeah. What's not to love in a chewy, hyper-referential, and elegant textual engagement, I asked. And then I felt immediate panic. What would happen to my reading and my research if I found myself stranded outside of academia after I graduated? I still haven't graduated. Why must scholarship and even basic knowledge now be screened behind a paywall? Why must scholarship so often seemingly exist exclusively for experts, when I happen to know so very many sophisticated literary thinkers who both do and do not possess graduate degrees? All right, we're going to Annulet now, if I can. Yes. Good enough. On a pandemic summer's day walk with friends, now Annulet's contributing editors, in which we discussed both the limited availability of short-form close reads, or writing on poetics in general, both in terms of extant outlets for such admittedly nerdy work, and those limits of institutional access, I posed the idea of starting my own journal. They very graciously encouraged me, and still encourage me, and sometimes they shouldn't encourage me, with all my ideas. I also wanted to put into intimate quarters this kind of rigorous thinking with both prose, a term I borrowed from Denver Quarterly, rather than fiction, and poetry, as these things are, as so many of us know and practice, not as separated as traditional publishing boundaries would make it seem. I missed asking people what they were reading at the bar. This is true. And getting answers that were straight from the heart and mind, not necessarily to do with their official research. I realized I wanted Annulet once I found the word, unusual, reminiscent of jubilat, but different enough and in alignment with the close reading form I would appropriate for experimental criticism from the explicator. It also means, Annulet means part of a column, a coin, what does it say? A moth. It's a kind of Scottish moth. And now it means a close reading. Yeah, let's see. Where was I? Yes. For poets, writers, scholars, and critics to consider in detail work or literary notions that are dear to them or deeply interesting, but perhaps not as well known, whether in public-facing criticism, writing for us, basically, or other creative forms. It turns out that many others felt very connected to this premise, to my surprise. And each issue has published around 40 to 50 individual writers. I began first by knowing that I didn't want the obvious visual hand of my design to compete with the primacy of the work itself. I didn't want the site to seem like an obvious WordPress or Squarespace template. And I knew that it was going to be online because it's only $99 a year to host, right? And that I also needed friendly but not indulgent cues to offset the intensity of scholarly attention or experimental writing. I wanted, in essence, for the digital page not to seem born digital, but physical, to have the presence of the flickering, hand-drawn, ever so slightly clumsy but loving A in the corner of the reader's eye. So we'll do this, and maybe it will flicker. Maybe it won't. Anyway. I emphasize language's material nature as specified. Let's do this. As specified in the submission guidelines for poetry and prose by a free use of color, which I often transfer from Joan Mitchell or Helen Frankenthaler paintings into the table of contents, as you see. Next, I mimic some elements that I most admired from New England Review, the editor's note, which I believe should not be cursory greeting cards, but is a microgenre in itself that does most of the intellectual scene setting, the framing but not over-determining of the issue's contents and the journal's latest activity, which sometimes includes my own literary proclivities. And then I realized I needed to build my interventions bridge. Most people I know want to write literary criticism in a range of registers. It's just that it's not a form that's actively taught or valued by hardcore academics. It's like we're expected to be born as fully flowered rhetoricians. So I thought essay categories might provide both structure and constraint. As of now, I have, as you see, annulets, comparatives, PNs, and comments, in addition to the normative genres of reviews, poetry, and prose. I have a category that no one's tried yet, called the Garland, in which a critic chooses an unpublished writer to consider and include a small selection of their work to accompany their essay. With Annulet, I want to put literary criticism back in hand, not to let it continue seeming remote, impossible, or a waste of time. Paying deep attention to someone's writing and sharing the fruits of that intricate engagement is never a waste of time. Things I do as part of my edifying daily, not monthly, conversations as an editor includes correspondence with authors, multiple rounds of edits, sometimes I've done 6 rounds of feedback, maintain a list of books for review, try to keep a handle on the submissions queue that is admittedly my weak spot. These these are the descriptions of the categories, and this is the review list of books. Annulet also publishes annual year-end contributor reading recommendations and hosts the Linkages lecture series and the Critical Circle Literary Criticism Workshop, which is currently hosting 3 sections of 4 writers each of these Sundays in July. Kelly Krumrye, a contributing editor, put together a fiction folio, and just the other day, I'm going to go to it because I'm so excited about it. I dreamed up an American Poetry and Poetics 2008 through 2025 folio, which will be published in the spring of 2025. With Cody Rose Clevenance, the poet, I edited and printed a very limited edition chapbook of 15 poems by the poet Bess Miller Brigham. And then there's Annulet editions, also launching in 2025. Which will publish 1 book of poetry and 1 book of literary criticism or prose a year. All of this activity will hopefully translate into planning a big reading and party in New York. That's not my only objective, but that was what I was thinking about last night. Like all the cool literati are doing these days, but without either the irony or the countercultural menace, and you're all invited. The questions that I ask through Annulet, like what is literary criticism? What is a literary journal? What do I value about poetry, about prose, about the book review, about others' relationship to what they read, are hopefully generative questions that stay in close contact with the source of literary production itself, the mind's own feeling, material, or thought. I hope always to read each writer's particular answer to or expression of that. Perhaps I love literary magazines because of their resilience and ephemerality, each issue its own little star in flickering orbit, which offers so many potential ways to inhabit, reinvent, and protect literary culture and community as it changes, bends, organizes, and accommodates increasingly pressurized economic, political, and other material realities. Literary journals have, and will continue to have, a lastingly and necessarily mercurial morphology, mythic, like Mercury, the god of the message and of shifting form. Thank you.
I'm glad he didn't have to throw it, I'm scared.
This is odd, but okay. This isn't directly about your presentation, but maybe it is indirectly anyway, which is how do you handle your 2 identities as poet and scholar? I mean, you're evidently quite the scholar, and we all learned a shit ton, so thank you. But you're also a poet, and I know those things don't necessarily always sit side by side, so all of us are also something and something else. So I thought maybe if you could speak to how you reconcile those 2 potentially on one level competing identities, that might be helpful for all of us too.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think, often my poetry takes the form of, has a literary critical point to make, and my criticism often is very expressive. I really care about the structure and the sound of the sentences and the rhythm and all of that. So I think the boundary between them is pretty porous, and I kind of allow myself to inhabit each of those things, right, as much as the disciplines will allow.
My question is, you mentioned that the editor has been, maybe, and possibly still is, sort of a cultural authority, and certainly uses their own taste and aesthetic. So I wanted to know, because you also said, yes, it should be more like a community of work, not just one kind. How do you deal with that when you're editing for your magazine?
Absolutely. Yeah, I find it, it's funny because to me, the literary vantage that I try to occupy is pretty heterogeneous. Like, as a reader, I love a beautiful, metrically perfect sonnet as much as I love, like, a poem that is designed on the web. And it's really through my love of form that I think allows me to realize when I'm making distinctions that feel personal, or when I'm making distinctions that feel like they're part of the important work of what's exciting about like work that comes in the submissions queue that I want to include in my journal. So I try to keep just a broad view about like what's new, what's exciting, what's participating in its tradition. And it's incumbent on me to kind of know, right? Like if a poem arrives in my inbox, it doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes from a life of reading, right? And I do my best to try to approximate basically everything that might possibly be read. No, just kidding. But truly, to do my best to understand where something's coming from. And that supersedes how I might personally feel about a poem that I publish versus something that I know and recognize as important and still feel passionately committed to. I almost feel weirdly more committed to the work that I don't like particularly and secretly love. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
What's the one piece, like short fiction or poetry, that you read that you really liked, but you didn't publish, and why?
Yeah.
Oh.
Because I think all beginning writers like to think that one of the reasons we didn't get accepted was because it just wasn't there.
Right.
So what's the one that you look back now and go, man,
I missed that.
maybe I should have.
I have that feeling much more about my work as the associate editor of Denver Quarterly, when I was really trying to seek work that fit with what I understood as that particular journal's niche. If something comes into Annulet and I'm activated and excited by it, and I forget that I'm reading a submission, basically, but then I come to a moment where I'm like, it's missing. I'll probably edit it. I'll probably reach out and ask the writer if they'd be willing to enter into editorial dialogue. So I'm really, probably a little more present than not. And I do it in a very respectful way. First of all, it's like, would you be willing to talk about this? You know, some people are like, this is my perfect child. And you're like, that's great, you know. But I like, my response in my capacity as editor of Annulet is to really try to help the work at any stage it might be at, whether it's not ready or ready. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for this free, fast and dirty graduate course in small press and literary magazine history. Let's give her one more round of applause. And we'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow we've got Charles Holdifer giving a lecture called Your Family and Other Animals, Using Creatures in Your Writing. If anyone wants to help fund Annulet, we've got these tote bags up here for sale. And otherwise, have a great lunch, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow.